Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 307. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Gil Evans, well, actually the Gil Evans Orchestra, made in 1961 or released in 1961 out of the Cool. And this is an original 1961 mono pressing, although there are good reasons to get a stereo pressing because you can see that not only are the locations of all the individual players noted, but also what they're playing and actually the kind of microphones which are used and where those microphones are. So this is an audiophile's treat. Now, I'm not really an audiophile, but I do know that audiophiles respond well to treats. So Gil Evans was a composer, an arranger, and a band leader who was instrumental in the development of post-war jazz. He's probably best known for his collaborations with Miles Davis. He was generally revered by the musicians who worked with him. Miles once called him the greatest musician in the world, but he never had the commercial success to match the critical acclaim. This is partly because he was often willing to accept lesser or even no credit for his work on records. He normally just took an arranger's credit when often his contribution was far more substantial, sometimes definitive. His marginal economic status was also due, it's said, to his incredibly slow creative process. However, this record comes from a time, the early 1960s, when Evans was as productive as he ever was or ever would be, and as commercially successful as he ever was or ever would be. Gil Evans was born in Toronto in May 1912 to Julia Margaret McConaughey. She was an Australian, she had been a singer in her youth, and she lived life which can best be described as full. Her first two husbands in Australia both died by the time that she was 26. She then moves to South Africa to work as a maid. When she's there, she meets a guy called Lionel Green. They get married, and they move to Toronto via the UK. They have young Gil in 1912, and then 6 months later, Lionel dies. Gil's mom then meets an American who takes the whole family down to Florida in 1915. They soon after get divorced, and Julia takes Gil and his sister and maybe some other kids, it's not really clear, back to Toronto. Then they go west. In 1919, they were in Saskatoon, and in 1920, they end up in Nelson, BC, in the Kootenays. And it's in Nelson that Julia meets and marries a guy called Jack Evans, who's a miner who would end up giving Gil his last and most permanent surname. They move to Washington State, then Idaho, then Montana, then Oregon, and then finally to California, where first they settle in Berkeley, and then later on move to Stockton, which is where Gil spends his teenage years. Somehow, during all of this, Gil manages to learn the piano, I guess from his mom, and at age 15 in Stockton, he sees Duke live, and his course in life is set. Not only could he perform on the piano, he had also learned to compose and arrange by transcribing music from records. And while still a teenager, he gets his first ever professional music gig at the Grand Hotel in Stockton, playing tea time piano. He graduates from high school in 1930. He then has a very brief post-secondary career, but he abandons that route after about a year and returns to the world of music, starting his own band in 1933, which played the arrangements which he had transcribed from records. The band progresses quickly. By 1935, they were the house band at the Rendezvous Ballroom in Balboa Beach, and that same year they shared the bill with Benny Goodman at the Palomar Ballroom in LA. The band starts getting booked regularly onto Bob Hope's radio show, and it's on the Hope show that Evans first encounters and befriends Claude Thornhill, the band leader and composer. Thornhill ends up being very influential on Evans. His band played music which was very uncluttered, had lots of long, drawn-out notes, very little vibrato. This made a huge impression on Evans. Evans begins to work for Thornhill as an arranger, and when Thornhill goes back to New York in 1941, Evans follows him. Then comes the war. Evans spends 4 years in the army, kind of, but really in bands, playing the bass drum. 1945, he comes back out. He's working for Thornhill again. Then begins this intense period of intellectual musical ferment involving not just Evans, but people like Jerry Mulligan, John Lewis, Lee Konitz, the modal musical theorist George Russell, and eventually, of course, Miles Davis. These guys would all meet at Gil's tiny apartment on 55th, where they basically plotted out what was going to happen in jazz after the bebop revolution. Charlie Parker would show up too, but apparently just to crash. That grouping of musical folk eventually results in the famous recordings made in 1949 and 1950, issued originally as singles, but then in 1957 as an LP, Birth of the Cool under Miles's name. Miles gets the plaudits and eventually the royalties, but none of this would have happened, of course, without Evans. Of course, at the time when these singles originally came out in 1949 and 1950, no one got plaudits or royalties. These things were basically dead in the water. So that group goes its separate ways. Mulligan goes out to the West Coast, and Miles goes off to do other things, and Gil Evans ends up spending the first half of the 1950s eking out a living as an arranger for this or that jazz album, nothing particularly major. Until 1956, he gets a phone call from Miles, which changes his life. Miles, of course, at that time had just been signed to Columbia, He was at a bit of a musical crossroads, and George Avakian, his producer at Columbia, said, "Well, why don't you work with an arranger?" And Miles said, "Yes, I'll work with Gil Evans." So he phones up Gil Evans, and this leads to three phenomenal records, the first of which is Miles Ahead in 1957, Porgy and Bess in 1958, and then, of course, Sketches of Spain in 1960. I've already discussed Sketches on this channel, and what it has in common with those other two is the pairing of Miles's beautiful, sort of pristine solo work with these not quite lush, but very interesting and sometimes challenging big band arrangements by Evans. And unlike the original Birth of the Cool sessions, these recordings did make a splash at the time they were made, and they made Evans a bit of a player. Now he's able to record as a leader for the first time. He makes Gil Evans in 10 for Prestige in 1957, and then a couple records for Dick Bach's Pacific Jazz, New Bottle, Old Wine in 1958, and Great Jazz Standards in 1959. Around this time, as students of jazz and regular viewers of this channel will know, Creed Taylor was in the process of persuading his bosses at ABC Paramount to allow him to start up his own jazz imprint, which of course would become known as Impulse. And Taylor was looking for high impact releases to launch the label, using Cadillac level talent to communicate to anybody who was paying attention that not only was Impulse a new label, it was a new major label. He'd lined up Ray Charles, he'd lined up John Coltrane, and he also knew the secret behind those successful records which Miles and Evans had made together, which was that Gil Evans's contribution was just as important as Miles's. So Evans, who had already been working on an extended piece which used big band orchestration but more contemporary arrangements and sounds, begins a 6-week series of performances kind of in preparation with his orchestra at the Jazz Gallery in New York before entering the studio with Taylor in November 1960. This record is made at Rudy Van Gilder's studio in Inglewood Cliffs with Creed Taylor producing. There are 4 sessions associated with this record, but only the last of those, on December the 15th, actually produces tapes from which the record is made. The first 3, on November 18th and 30th and December 10th, are just rehearsals, which tells you a little bit about how much financial backing Taylor enjoyed in the early days at Impulse. There are about 14 musicians on here. Evans plays piano, he conducts, and he arranges. There are a bunch of other big names, including some people who became big names after this record. On here we have a young Ron Carter on bass, Elvin Jones and Charlie Persip on drums, Ray Crawford on guitar, Jimmy Knepper on trombone, Johnny Coles, fantastic Johnny Coles, on trumpet, Tony Studd on bass trombone, and 7 other brass and reed players. When it was released, it was not like anything else available, and you can imagine almost every other composer of TV and movie soundtracks in the 60s and 70s had to have listened to this record at some point. What's kind of fascinating is the juxtaposition between more traditional sounds, the orchestration of the big band, with contemporary sounds like the guitar. It's definitely listening music. It's certainly not dance music. If anything, it's a bit like a film score, but I don't mean to imply that it's dull, because what this is a really impressive collection of moods. Evans continues to record. He ends up making another record in particular with Taylor when Taylor was at Verve, the individualism of Gil Evans, but he never really quite had the same impact on the musical world again. Side 1 starts with what is really the showpiece of this whole record, La Nevada. This is a very, very cool track. You have this piano figure and the maracas from Evans, although maybe I think it's Elvin playing the maracas because Gil's playing the piano, which set the tempo, and the whole thing, other than the theme, is essentially improvised. It is, not to trivialize it, like the coolest cop show soundtrack you've ever heard. A big part of that is this very cool riffing by the bass trombonist Tony Studd, and again, I mentioned Ray Crawford's guitars, this very interesting counterpoint. Where Flamengos Fly is the second track on side 1. It's a haunting tune, and it's basically a vehicle for Jimmy Knepper's really, really beautiful solo work on trombone. The whole dynamism of the record continues on side 2 with Bill Bau's song. Then we have George Russell's Stratus Funk, which theoretically is modally inspired. Maybe it is, but to me it sounds a lot more like what one reviewer described it as more spiky cop jazz. It's excellent. And Crawford's guitar and Coles' trumpet and Studd's almost farty sounding bass trombone are keys to the whole feel of this piece. The record ends with Sunken Treasure, which is a short little piece with some fantastic work by Johnny Coles on trumpet. I don't listen to much in the way of big bands or jazz orchestras typically, but I absolutely love this. It defies most of the big band stereotypes. It might not be the first place to start with Evans. I would go with Birth of the Cool or perhaps Sketches of Spain, but it most certainly belongs in your jazz library. And for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.